Nobody wanted her. That was the truth nobody said out loud, but everybody knew it. They looked at Clara Whitmore the way people look at a house after a fire. Sad eyes, quick glances, then looking away fast before she caught them staring. She was 26 years old. She had buried, a husband, lost a baby before it ever drew breath, and watched everything she thought her life would be turned to ash in the space of 18 months. Back in 1873, a widow with no money, no family left, and no future wasn't a tragedy people lingered over. She was a problem. A quiet, polite, well-dressed problem, but a problem all the same. The women in Millhaven, Kansas felt sorry for her the way you feel sorry for a stray dog in winter. They brought her bread, and they nodded at church. They didn't invite her to sit with them. The men looked at her differently. Plus, not with cruelty, but with a kind of calculation, the same look a farmer gives a plot of land he's deciding isn't worth the trouble. She had no dowry anymore. Her late husband's debts had eaten through that. She had to be fair, her 2 hands, her quiet dignity, and a small room above the general store where she sewed and mended and tried not to think too hard about what came next. What came next, it turned out, was a wagon train heading west, and a desperate letter from a settlement preacher who needed a schoolteacher and didn't much care about her history, and a series of events so unlikely, so raw, and so completely outside anything Clara had ever imagined for herself, that by the time a Lakota war chief looked at her across a fire and asked, in careful, deliberate English, "Will you take my name?" she had already stopped being the woman Millhaven had pitted. She had become someone else entirely, which this is that story. The morning Clara Whitmore decided to leave Millhaven, Kansas, it was raining so hard the mud in the street looked alive. She stood at the small window above Greer's general store and watched the water pour off the roof in sheets, and she thought about how she had stood at this same window for 14 months now, watching different kinds of weather come and go, and how nothing about her life had changed except that she had gotten quieter, more invisible, more careful about taking up space. She had a letter in her hand. It had arrived 3 days ago, forwarded through the church missionary board, addressed not to her namely, but to any capable woman of good Christian character willing to serve as teacher in the new settlement of Harlow Creek, Dakota Territory. The preacher who wrote it, a Reverend Josiah Phelps, wasn't a poetic man. The letter was 4 sentences long. It promised a roof, a small salary, and the honest work of educating the children of settlers who had come west looking for land and found mostly hardship. It promised nothing else. It didn't mention comfort or safety or what lay beyond the edges of the settlement, because Reverend Phelps was a practical man and probably figured that any woman brave enough to answer the letter already knew. Clara had read it 6 times. She had prayed over it twice. She had lain awake in the dark listening to the rain and thinking about the alternative, which was another winter in this room, another season of careful invisibility, another year of being the widow everyone pitied and no one chose. She wasn't, woman who had ever made reckless decisions. She had been sensible her whole life, which sensible about her education, sensible about her marriage to Robert Whitmore, who had been a decent man with a good reputation and a small farm outside town. Sensible about her grief when Robert died of fever in the spring of 1872, and sensible again when the baby she had been carrying since February was born too early and too silent in June of that same year. Sensible had not served her especially well, which she folded the letter, put it in the pocket of her gray dress, and went downstairs to tell Mrs. Greer she would be leaving at the end of the month. Mrs. Greer was a stout woman with sharp eyes and a good heart buried under a great deal of practical caution. She looked at Clara the way she looked at customers who wanted to return merchandise, not unkindly, but with a kind of assessment happening behind her eyes. Dakota Territory, she said, not a question, more like she was testing the weight of the words. Yes, ma'am. That's Sioux country up there. You know that. I know it. Mrs. Greer was TBH, quiet for a moment. She straightened a bolt of cloth that didn't need straightening. You're a smart woman, Clara. Kind of always have been. I just want to make sure you're thinking clearly and not running. Clara looked at her steadily. Maybe both things can be true at once. Mrs. Greer nodded slowly, the way people nod when they've decided to accept an answer they're not entirely satisfied with. She didn't try to talk Clara out of it again. That was one of the things Clara, had always respected about her. She knew when a decision had been made. The wagon train assembled on the 1st of October. There were 11 wagons in total, organized by a route captain named Aldous Burke, who had made the crossing to Dakota Territory twice before and had opinions about everything: the weather, the pace, the proper way to grease an axle, the particular foolishness of bringing excessive furniture. He looked at Clara's single trunk and small bag and gave a nod of approval that she suspected was the warmest welcome she was going to get from him. The other travelers were a mixed company. 3 farm families with children of various ages, all of them carrying that particular look of people who have made an enormous decision and aren't entirely sure they believe in it yet. A young couple barely older than 20. The husband with the eager energy of a man who thinks the frontier is an adventure, and the wife with the steady, private expression of a woman who has already done the more realistic calculations and decided she loves him anyway. 2 brothers from Ohio, lanky and sunburned, going west to file a land claim together. And a quiet, compact man named Samuel Adler who said very little about his reasons for going and whose saddlebags clinked softly when he moved, suggesting either a doctor or a man with a drinking problem, and who turned out to be both. Clara made herself useful. That was kind of what she did. Plus, for what it's worth, she had learned it early, that the surest way to earn your place among people who didn't know you was to do things without being asked. She helped with the cooking on the 3rd day out when one of the farm wives, Mrs. Halverson, came down with a miserable head cold and couldn't stand upright without swaying. She sat with the children in the evenings when the adults needed to talk. She cleaned wounds when a 10-year-old named Peter Halverson sliced his palm open on a poorly secured metal bracket, doing it calmly and without fuss while Peter tried very hard not to cry and almost succeeded. She wasn't trying to make friends. Plus, she wasn't sure she still knew how. But she noticed, somewhere around the 2nd week of travel, that people had stopped treating her like a passenger and started treating her like a member of the group. It was a small shift. Plus, the kind you only notice in retrospect. One evening, Mrs. Ann Halverson recovered from her cold and, back to her formidable self, poured Clara a cup of coffee without being asked and sat down beside her without comment. And that was all it was really, but Clara felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't known was tight. The land changed as they moved north and west. The sort of flat, familiar Kansas prairie gave way to something wider and stranger, a space so large it seemed to press down on you even as it stretched away in every direction. The sky was enormous here, and at night, the stars weren't the polite, decorative stars of town sky, but something overwhelming, a density of light that made Clara feel simultaneously very small and strangely comforted, as though the smallness weren't an insult, but simply the truth, and the truth was easier than pretending. Aldous Burke drove them hard, and he wanted to be through the exposed stretch of the northern route before the weather turned serious. And his anxiety about the weather was so consistent and specific that Clara eventually trusted it more than anything else he said. He knew this land. He knew what it could do. They were 3 weeks out when they found the boy. He was sitting beside the trail, which wasn't really a trail, but a series of wheel ruts that suggested other wagons had passed this way and possibly survived. He was perhaps 8 years old, Lakota, with a badly injured left leg, and the particular stillness of a child who has already decided that crying won't help. He wasn't hiding. He was simply sitting, watching the wagons approach with the careful, measuring look of someone who has learned to assess threats accurately and quickly. The wagon slowed. Plus, I think there was a ripple of unease through the company, the kind of collective nervousness that travels through a group the way wind moves through grass, visible and fast. Aldous Burke pulled up and sat looking at the boy with an expression that wasn't hostile, but was calculating. Several of the men had their hands on their rifles without having made a conscious decision to put them there. Clara got down from the wagon. She didn't think about it much. She just did it. Clara. That was Burke's voice, flat and warning. She walked to where the boy was sitting. He watched her come. He didn't move. His leg was folded at an angle that looked wrong, and there was dried blood on his knee and calf, and he'd been out here long enough that his lips were dry. She crouched actually down to his level and looked at him directly, and he looked back at her, and neither of them spoke because they didn't share a language, but she opened her hands to show him they were empty, and after a moment he gave a very small nod that she interpreted correctly as permission. She cleaned his leg as carefully as she could with what she had. The break, in my opinion, wasn't as bad as it looked, a bad sprain and a deep gash rather than a fracture, which was lucky for him. She worked quietly, and he endured it quietly, and when she was done, she sat back on her heels and looked at him and felt something she hadn't expected, which was the particular emotion of recognizing someone else's loneliness as identical to your own. She gave him water from her canteen. He drank half of it and looked at her. Behind her, she could hear Burke and some of the men having a low, tense conversation about what to do. The boy couldn't travel with him. That was Burke's position. He had nothing against the child personally, but taking a Lakota boy was the kind of thing that created complications he didn't need. Better to leave him water and food and let his own people find him. They were probably close. They were always watching the trails. Clara didn't argue with him. She stood up and she said, "All right," and she went back to her wagon and got the small bundle she had wrapped while Burke was still talking, her second blanket, a portion of dried meat, and hardtack, the last of her clean bandaging linen, and she brought it back and set it beside the boy, who watched her do all of this with those steady, measuring eyes. "Someone will come for you," she said. Plus, she knew he didn't understand the words. She said them anyway, because she thought the tone might carry some of the meaning, and because she needed to say something true. She went back to her wagon. The company moved on. She didn't look back. Plus, not because she didn't want to, but because she had learned that looking back was a particular kind of cruelty you could do to yourself, and she had gotten careful about that. They reached a creek crossing the next afternoon that gave Burke trouble. The water was higher than he'd expected, running fast and brown with recent rain, and the bottom was uncertain. He sent one of the Ohio brothers across first on horseback to test it, and the horse went into its belly before the brother guided it out the other side with a breathless, relieved look on his face. Passable. Barely, which they were getting the third wagon across, the heaviest one, belonging to a family named Coulter, when the wool caught in a submerged rut, and the whole thing canted sideways with a sound like something enormous being pulled apart. The Coulter children screamed. Mrs. Coulter grabbed for them, and the horses lurched. The wagon went further. Clara was in the water before she was aware of having made the decision to enter it. She had the rope from her own wagon in her hands. She had picked it up during the crossing preparation without knowing why, some instinct from the edge of her thinking. She got it around the rear axle of the tilting wagon while the water pushed at her thighs, and then her waist, cold enough to compress her breathing in shallow, quick bursts. Burke was yelling. Someone else was yelling. She knotted the rope with her hands gone numb and got back to the bank, and they pulled Burke and the Ohio brothers and Samuel Adler, the young husband, all on the rope together, and the wagon groaned and shifted and came up out of the rut, and the horses found their footing, and it was across. The Coulter children were unhurt, and Mrs. Coulter was shaking so hard she couldn't speak. Mr. Coulter stood TBH on the bank with the look of a man who has just watched something terrible almost happen and is only now beginning to understand that it didn't. Clara stood in the shallows, wringing water from her skirt. She was shaking too, but the shaking was from cold, not fear, or she told herself that, and mostly believed it. Samuel Adler brought her his coat, without comment. She put on. Burke looked at her for a long moment. "Reckless," he said. "Yes," she agreed. He almost smiled. It was the closest he had come to it in 3 weeks. They made camp early that night because the Coulter wagon needed inspection and 2 of the horses needed rest. Clara sat by the fire and let the warmth work on her slowly, and she listened to the sounds of the camp settling. Children being put to sleep, low conversation between the men, the particular quiet of the open land pressing in around the firelight. The sky was, in my opinion, going dark in shades of purple and deep gold, and above the hills to the west the first stars were appearing sort of one by one, and Clara sat and watched them and thought with a clarity that surprised her that she wasn't unhappy. Sort of not happy exactly. Plus, not settled. But not, the particular gray flatness of Millhaven. Something different. Something that had the texture of being awake. Mrs. Halverson sat down beside her with 2 cups of coffee and handed her one without ceremony, and they sat together watching the fire burn down, and after a while Mrs. Halverson said, "You aren't what I expected, Mrs. Whitmore." Clara looked at her. "What did you expect?" "A frightened woman." Mrs. Halverson considered. "Or a hard one. Those are usually the kinds that travel alone." "Maybe I am both," Clara said. Mrs. Halverson shook her head slowly. "No, which you're something else. I'm not sure what yet." Clara didn't answer. She looked at the fire. Plus, she thought about the boy by the trail and hoped someone had found him before dark. She thought about Robert, briefly, the way she had learned to, quickly, gently, setting it down again before it could settle into weight. She, to be fair, thought about Millhaven and found for the first time that thinking about it produced nothing much. No longing, no bitterness, just the mild, clear sensation of distance. She was 7 weeks from everything she had known. She was traveling toward a settlement that might be barely more than mud and optimism. She had no husband, no family, no clear idea of what waited for her at the end of this journey except hard work and the company of strangers. She drank her coffee. The stars were fully out now, the full, impossible density of them, and the fire crackled, and the horses shifted in the dark, and somewhere out beyond the edge of the firelight the land went on, and on in the dark, enormous and indifferent, and she was slowly understanding this, entirely free of opinions about who she was or what had happened to her. It was the first place she had been in almost 2 years that didn't already know her story. She could be anyone here. She didn't know yet what that meant. She didn't, to be fair, know yet that in 3 days, a Lakota warrior named Sunkilled Hawk would ride into their camp at dawn to retrieve his nephew, the boy she had bandaged by the trail, and that he would look at her across the fire with eyes that missed nothing, and that she would look back without flinching, and that something would begin in that moment that neither of them could have named or predicted or chosen to avoid. She didn't know basically any of that yet. She just knew the stars and the fire and the quiet, spreading knowledge that she was still capable of surprise. That was enough. For now, it was more than enough. The camp settled. The fire burned to coals. One by one the lamps went out, and Clara wrapped Samuel Adler's borrowed coat tighter and stayed a little longer looking at the dark hills and the stars and breathing the cold, clean Dakota air that tasted like nothing she had ever breathed before. She wasn't the woman Millhaven had pitted. She wasn't sure yet who she was, but she was beginning to find the question interesting. He came at dawn, which Clara was already awake. She had been awake for an hour, sitting at the edge of the camp with her knees pulled to her chest and her breath making small clouds in the cold air, watching the sky go from black to a deep, bruised blue to the pale gray that comes just before color returns to the world. She had not slept well, and the ground was hard, and the cold had pressed through her bedroll in the hours before morning, and she had given up fighting it somewhere around 3 in the morning, and simply lain still, listening to the sounds of the sleeping camp and the sounds of the land beyond it. Wind in the dry grass, something moving in the dark at a distance. The particular silence of the plains at night that wasn't really silence at all, but a kind of breathing. She heard the horses before she saw him. Not her company's horses. They were staked and quiet. These were different, approaching from the north with a steady, unhurried rhythm that suggested someone who knew exactly where he was going and had no interest in concealment. She stood. The light was still very low. She actually could make out the shapes of the riders, 2 of them, before she could make out the details. She didn't call out for Burke or for any of the men. She stood still and watched them come, and something in her was very calm, the way she had been. Calm at the river crossing, the particular stillness that came on her in moments when most people would be afraid. The first rider stopped at the edge of the camp's perimeter. He looked at her, and the light was just enough now. She could see him clearly, and he could see her. He was a large man, broad through the shoulders, dressed in a combination of traditional clothing and practical additions that spoke of someone who moved between worlds with deliberate intention. His face was composed and unreadable. He had the look of a man who was accustomed to being assessed and had long ago decided other people's assessments weren't his business. Beside him on a smaller horse was the boy. His leg was wrapped in something better than what Clara had used, proper binding, tight and clean. He was, for what it's worth, looking at her with that same steady, measuring expression she remembered. After a moment, he said something to the man beside him in Lakota. A short sentence, The man's eyes moved back to Clara with a different quality of attention. The man dismounted. Plus, he walked toward her with a measured, deliberate movement of someone who has learned that rapid motion reads as aggression and prefers to be clearly understood. He stopped a few feet away and looked at her directly, not rudely, but with a completeness that she wasn't used to, the look of someone who was seeing all of her at once rather than the selected, acceptable parts people usually allow themselves to see. He said something in Lakota. Then, in English I guess, that was careful and precisely formed, "My nephew." "You helped him?" "Yes," Clara said, which he was quiet for a moment. "Why?" It wasn't quite a question, and it was the kind of statement that expects an honest answer rather than a polite one. Clara thought about it. "He was, well, hurt," she said, which he was alone. The man looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his expression. Not warmth, exactly, but the first suggestion of reconsideration. He said something to the boy. The boy answered, and the man listened, and then he looked at Clara again. "He says you weren't afraid of him. He's 8 years old. Many people are afraid of him. Because of what he's." "That seems like their problem," Clara said. Something shifted in the man's face, and it was very brief, and it wasn't a smile, but it had the quality of smile, the interior movement that precedes one. He reached into the bag at his hip and brought out something wrapped in soft leather, and he held it out to her. She looked at it. He was patient. She took it, and inside the wrapping was a small, intricately beaded strip of work, deep blue and white, and a particular shade of red, tight and perfect. She had never seen anything so precisely made. "This is, I guess, good thing," he said. The English was careful, each word placed where he intended it. "Thank you," Clara said. "I didn't do it for payment." "I know." He looked at her. "That is why." Behind her, she heard Burke's voice, sudden and sharp. "Clara, get back from there." She heard boots on the hard ground, the sound of men waking fast and reaching for things. The man in front of her didn't move or change. He tracked the movement behind her with his eyes without turning, assessed it, and returned his attention to her. For what it's worth, he wasn't concerned. He was simply gathering information. "Who is this?" Burke was beside her now, his hand not quite on his rifle, but not quite off it either. "His name," Clara TV said. "I don't know yet. He came for the boy I helped 3 days ago." Burke looked from her to the man and back. His jaw was tight. "You should have woken me." There wasn't time. The Lakota man watched this exchange. When it was done, he looked at Burke directly and said, "I am Tsunk Luda." A pause. "In your language, Red Horse. I speak for the Itazapakala band in this territory. You are passing through." It wasn't a question. Passage is permitted. Trouble is not. Burke's expression was complicated. He was a man who had been on the frontier long enough to know the difference between posturing and information, and what he was receiving now was information. "We mean no trouble," he said, "which we're bound for Harlow Creek settlement. 3 more look days." Red Horse looked at him for a moment, then back at Clara. "The woman," he said. "She's going to the settlement?" "Yes," Clara said. He nodded once, a small, precise movement. He turned back to his horse, and then he stopped and looked at her over his shoulder. "Harlow Creek has a difficult winter ahead," he said. "If there's trouble, the settlement people should send word to the Itazapakala before they send soldiers." He said the last word with a particular flatness that made its full meaning clear. "Soldiers make trouble larger." He mounted. The pretty much boy on the small horse looked at Clara one more time with those dark, measuring eyes, and then they were both riding north. Within a few minutes, the sound of the horses had gone, and the gray light was brightening, and the camp was fully awake and gathered around Clara with questions she couldn't entirely answer. Burke looked at the beaded leather in her hands. He didn't say anything about it, which what he said was, "We break camp in an hour," and walked away. She didn't see Red Horse again for nearly 3 weeks. Harlow Creek was exactly what Reverend Phelps's letter had implied: raw, new, and sustained by determined optimism. The settlement had perhaps 60 permanent residents, a church that doubled as a meeting hall, a trading post run by a man named Garfield who had 3 kinds of flour and an opinion about everything, and a schoolhouse that was actually a renovated storage building with new windows and a pot-bellied stove that worked adequately. There, I think, were children, 14 of them in the first week, ranging from age 6 to 15, brought by parents who believed in education with the passionate conviction of people who had not always had access to it. Clara stood in the schoolhouse on the first morning and looked at the rows of mismatched chairs. The 14 faces looking back at her, and she felt something she recognized, finally, as the thing she'd been moving toward without knowing it. Pretty much purpose. Clean and specific. This is the thing you're for. Not widow, not charity case, not the woman in the upstairs room. Teacher. Here. Now. Plus, she was good at it. Not the kind of good that requires being told. The kind that was simply evident in how quickly the children came back, and how they came earlier each day, and how the older ones who were supposed to be past school age started showing up in the back row with elaborately casual expressions, pretending they had just happened to be walking past. The settlement accepted look her the way settlements accept useful people, practically without ceremony, with the particular directness of a community that has no energy to waste on social niceties. Mrs. Phelps, the Reverend's wife, gave her a room in their house that was small, but had a south-facing window and good light. Garfield at the trading post stopped charging her full price for things she needed without making a production of it. The children's mothers brought her food periodically in the way that frontier women feed someone they've decided belongs to them. She wasn't unhappy. She was, in fact, better than she had been in years. But there was a strangeness to the settlement that took her time to understand, a tension that lived underneath the daily industry of the place, present in the way people looked toward the hills sometimes, in the conversations that stopped when she walked into a room, in the too careful way Reverend Phelps talked about relations with the Lakota bands in the area. The settlement had been built on land that was, depending on who you asked, either legitimately ceded or not legitimately ceded. The people who lived in the settlement had not, for the most part, been the ones to make that determination. They had come because there was land, and they had nothing, and the specific legal and moral complexities of what had come before them were things they thought about at night, and try not to think about in the daytime. It wasn't a comfortable position. Most of them handled it with the particular stubbornness of people who have already made an irreversible decision and need to believe in it. The first real trouble came in November, when 3 young men from a settlement 30 miles south came through Harlow Creek with news that a group of Lakota hunters had been fired on by a military patrol near the Cheyenne River. No one killed, but horses taken and a man injured. The news moved through the settlement like current through water. Clara watched it happen, watched the men's faces close, watched the women pull children indoors faster, watched Garfield clean his rifle that evening with very careful attention. She took the beaded strip of leather out of her trunk that night and sat with it in her hands. She thought about what Red Horse had said. Soldiers make trouble larger. The second time she saw him was at the trading post. She had come for chalk and paper and was standing at Garfield's counter when she became aware of the way you become aware of a change in air pressure before a storm, that something in the room had shifted. She turned. He was in the doorway, not quite inside. His eyes moved around the room with that complete, gathering attention, taking everything in, and then they found her and stopped. Garfield's hand had gone under the counter. Clara put for what it's worth her hand on the counter herself. Not toward Garfield, just a presence, a steadiness. And she looked at Red Horse and said, "Come in if you're coming." He came in. Garfield's hand stayed where it was, which Red Horse looked at what he needed. She could see him deciding it. And he brought a piece of elk hide to the counter and placed it down, and he looked at Garfield until Garfield made himself bring his hand back up and look at the hide and name a price, and they negotiated in the flat, careful English of 2 men who don't fully trust each other and know it, and the transaction was completed, and through all of this Clara organized her chalk and paper and didn't leave. When, in my opinion, Garfield went to the back for something, Red Horse looked at her. "You are still here," he said. "Plus, I live here now. The children. You teach them." She wasn't surprised he knew. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "My nephew," he said. "He should learn your reading." The room went very still in her head. She looked at him steadily. "I teach anyone who comes," she said. "That has been my position since the first day." He looked at her for a long moment. Then, "You say, I mean, this knowing it will cause difficulty." "I say it because it's true." He nodded. Once, the same small, precise movement as before, he picked up his purchase. At the door he stopped, and he looked back at her, and she had the distinct sensation of being seen, fully, clearly, without reduction, in a way she had not been seen in a very long time. "Your name," he said. "Clara like Whitmore." He said it once, quietly, as though testing how it fit. Then, he was gone. Garfield came back from the storeroom. He looked at the empty doorway. He looked at Clara. He said nothing, which was, for Garfield, the most expressive response available to him. Clara, for what it's worth, picked up her chalk and paper. "Good morning, Mr. Garfield," she said, and walked out into the cold November air. She stood on the wooden walkway outside the trading post for a moment, her breath clouding, looking at the tracks Red Horse's horse had left in the frost. The tracks went north. She looked at them and thought about the beaded leather in her trunk and the look on his face when he said her name. And she thought about the boy who would be coming to her classroom, and she thought about the tension that lived underneath this settlement like a river under ice. And she thought clearly, plainly, without flinching from it, that things were about to become considerably more complicated. She didn't feel afraid. She felt the same thing she had felt sitting by the fire on the trail, watching the stars come out over the enormous dark hills. Alive, specific, present. She went back to her classroom. The children were already there. She taught them reading and numbers and the names of the presidents and the geography of the country they were all of them, trying to build themselves into. She taught them well. And 3 days later, on a gray Thursday morning, when the first real snow of winter was sitting on the edge of the sky waiting to fall, the door of the schoolhouse opened, and a boy of about 8 years old came in and stood in the doorway and looked at her with dark, steady eyes she recognized immediately. He had brought something with him, a younger girl, perhaps 6, who clung to his hand and looked around the classroom with huge, serious eyes. They were both in practical winter clothing, both composed and watchful. The other children went very quiet. Clara stood up. "Honestly, come in," she said. "Sit anywhere you like." The boy looked at her for a moment. Then he came actually in, his sister in tow, and sat down in the second row. The other children watched. The, smaller girl watched back with a forthrightness that eventually made the child next to her, a girl named Bess Coulter, let out a surprised, involuntary giggle. The smaller girl considered this, and then carefully and deliberately smiled. It was the small moments. That was what Clara was learning. To be fair, change didn't announce itself. It didn't arrive on horseback with a speech. It kind of sat down in the second row and smiled at the girl next to it. And something shifted that couldn't be shifted back. She taught them all that day. The snow, came in the afternoon, light and steady, covering the settlement in white that made everything look cleaner than it was. She walked home in the early dark, her footsteps loud in the new snow, and she looked at the lights in the windows of the houses and felt for the first time since Robert died that she was somewhere she had chosen. Not somewhere she had ended up. Somewhere she had chosen. The difference was everything. His name was Chayton. That, honestly, was what she learned first, that the boy was called Chayton, which meant falcon in the Lakota language, and that the small girl with him was his sister Winona, which meant firstborn daughter. Clara learned these things from the children themselves, in the slow, patient vocabulary of people who share no language and make one anyway with pointing and drawing and the particular focused attention of children who want to understand. By the end of the first week, she knew their names and the names of several things in their world, and they knew the English words for the same things, and every day the vocabulary grew because children are extraordinarily good at learning what they need. The other parents noticed. Not all of them were pleased. She had 2 conversations in the first week. One with a father named Coulter who said he supposed it was all right, wanted to know if it would slow down the instruction for his own children, and one with a woman named Mrs. Braddock who didn't ask a question but stood in front of Clara's classroom after school with an expression that communicated her position fully. Clara acknowledged both of them the same way, with calm, direct courtesy and no alteration of anything she was doing. She had not come this far to be managed by someone else's discomfort. Reverend Phelps surprised her. He, I think, was a quiet, narrow man with a deep sense of duty and a more complex understanding of the settlement situation than most people gave him credit for. He came to her room one evening and sat across the table from her and talked for an hour, not about whether she should be teaching the Lakota children, but about the history of the Itazapakla band and the specific tensions of this particular stretch of territory, and the names of the men who made decisions on both sides. Was informing her, treating her as someone who needed to know the context of what she was doing. She found, I think, it unexpectedly, genuinely, the most useful conversation she had had since arriving. "Red Horse," she said, when he had been talking for a while. "He comes to the trading post." Phelps nodded. "He tests the temperature, sees how we're managing. He's been doing it since the first summer. The men, in my opinion, don't like it, but the truth is he's been a moderating force. When the military patrols push too hard, it's Red Horse that keeps the young men from responding in kind. He has considerable authority. And the patrol situation near the Cheyenne River." Phelps's face went. Still in the way faces go still when a subject is too large and too close. "That is going to require careful handling," he said. "Careful handling that some people in this territory aren't interested in providing." He meant the military. She understood without needing him to explain further. She had been in Harlow Creek long enough to understand the particular texture of that problem. The way the Army's presence was simultaneously a source of supposed security and an almost reliable generator of exactly the conflicts it claimed to be preventing. She had heard enough conversations in Garfield's trading post to know that, the men who made decisions about military responses weren't the men who would live with the consequences. She taught Chayton and Winona through November into December. They were quick children, not just in the way that eager children are quick, but in the specific, particular way of children who have been trained to observe, to notice, to hold information. Chayton could replicate a written word after seeing it twice. Winona, who Clara had initially thought was shy, turned out to be strategic. She watched and absorbed for days before beginning to speak, and when she began, her English came out incomplete, careful sentences that made the other children blink. Clara developed a system. Mornings were formal instruction, reading, writing, arithmetic for all children together. Afternoons, she pretty much spent more time in individual work, and this was where the language exchange happened most naturally. The Lakota children taught her things she hadn't expected to want to know, and then found she couldn't stop thinking about. The way Lakota counted relationships rather than individuals, the specific vocabulary for types of silence, the way direction was described relative to the land rather than to the speaker. She wrote things down in a small notebook that she kept in her coat pocket, and she went back to it at night and looked at the words and thought about what they told her about the people who had invented them. Red Horse came to the trading post twice more in December. Both times she was there, which the first time was accidental. She needed salt and sugar, and the second time she noticed in the privacy of her own thoughts that she had gone in the late afternoon instead of the morning, which was the time she usually saw him, and that this wasn't entirely accidental. She noted this fact about herself and didn't make too much of it and didn't make too little of it and put her salt and sugar in her basket and went home. He spoke to her both times, briefly, and with TBH, the particular economy of someone who doesn't use word for comfort, but uses them for information, and who considers the information he chooses to share very carefully before sharing it. He asked about the children. He told her that Chayton had been speaking English at home to anyone who would stand still long enough to listen. Something in his voice, when he said this, a particular resonance, a warmth kept at close control, told her that the boys' enthusiasm had been going on at the evening fire, and that Red Horse was perhaps tired, and also entirely unwilling to stop it. She said, "He is one of the best students I've had." He looked at her. "You are saying this to make me think well of the school. I'm saying it because it's true. I don't say things just to make people comfortable." A pause. "I've enticed this," he said. TBH, she looked at him. He looked at her. Plus, it actually was a simple, ordinary exchange of words in a cold, dim trading post with Garfield pretending to be busy, with inventory 12 feet away, and yet it had the quality, she thought about this later, lying awake in her south-facing room, of something that had found its level. Two people who spoke to each other in the same undecorated way, without performance or social management, in a register of people who have both learned that honesty is less exhausting than the alternative. She didn't let herself think about it too much. She had things to do. Christmas came to Harlow Creek with a directness that was touching in its determination. The settlement decorated what it had. The children performed a simple program in the schoolhouse, a poem, a hymn, a short recitation of scripture. That Peter Halverson delivered with the earnest solemnity of a boy who had practiced too hard and wasn't going to let that go to waste. Chayton and Winona sat in the back row in a position that was technically present, but prepared for rapid departure if required. Clara had not told them to come. They had come. At the end, when the parents were crowding in and the children were dissolving into the warm chaos of post-performance relief, Winona made her way to Clara's side and took her hand. Not asking for anything, just holding it. Clara looked down at her. Winona looked up with those serious, comprehending eyes. Clara held her hand back, which it was that simple, and it meant more than she could easily explain. January came in cold. Not the manageable cold of Kansas winters, but the deep, structural cold of the northern plains, a cold that meant business, that moved into buildings through every gap and joint, that made the horses stand close and the dogs sleep in piles, and the settlers run a constant calculation of firewood against temperature. Clara's classroom acquired a second stove, donated by Mr. Coulter in a gesture that she understood as both practical and apologetic, and she accepted it as both. The trouble, she had known was coming arrived in the second week of January. A military patrol out of Fort Thompson came through the settlement, looking for a group of Lakota men believed to have been present when a government surveying party was forcibly turned back from land, the Itazapacala, considered unceded territory. No one had been hurt in the surveying incident. Property had been damaged, and the surveyors had been frightened, which was, as far as the Army was concerned, sufficient cause for a response. The patrol's lieutenant was a man named Carver, young and certain, with a specific dangerous combination of genuine conviction and inadequate experience that Clara had learned to identify on sight. He came to Reverend Phelps first. Then he made a circuit of the settlement, asking questions with the tone of someone who already has his answers and is looking for confirmation. When he came to the schoolhouse, Clara was in the middle of a reading lesson. He opened the door without knocking, looked at the classroom, and his face changed when he saw Chayton and Winona in the second row. Mrs. Whitmore. He TBH had done his research. Plus, I wasn't aware the settlement school had Sioux students. It does, Clara said. She didn't stop what she was doing, which was standing at the board with chalk in her hand. She turned back to the board and wrote the next word. Pretty much. Please close the door. It's cold. He didn't close the door. He stood for a moment in the open doorway with cold air moving past him into the room, and she could feel the children going still the way children go still when adults are tense. Actually, Chayton had not moved. His face was composed and unreadable, a face she recognized as a very deliberate performance of calm. He was 8 years old, and he knew exactly what this man's presence meant. These children's people have committed offenses against federal property, Carver said. Their presence here is a complication. Clara turned. She put the chalk down on the edge of the board and faced him. She was aware of 22 children watching her, including 2 children who had considerably more to lose from this moment than the others. She, was aware of what she was about to say and what would cost her in some quarters, and she said it clearly and without drama, because drama wasn't a register. These children are students. They are here to learn. If you've official business in Harlow Creek, Reverend Phelps is the right person to speak with. If you don't, I'm going to ask you to close that door. Carver looked at her. He wasn't accustomed to this tone from a woman. She could see him deciding how to process it. She held his gaze and waited. He, I guess, pulled the door closed. She heard his boots on the wooden step and then in the snow outside. She turned back to the board. Where were we? She said, in the same tone she always used for the lesson, and several children exhaled, and someone found the page, and she wrote the next word on the board, and they continued. After school, she walked directly to Reverend Phelps. She told him what had happened. He listened with his hands folded on the table and his eyes on the middle distance. When she, I guess, finished, he said, I'll speak with Carver. But, Clara, this is going to escalate. You should know that. I know that. If he reports back to Fort Thompson that the settlement is harboring, his word, Lakota children in our school, there will be pressure. Some of it will land on you. I imagine it will. He looked at her. You're not going to change what you're doing. I'm not going to refuse to teach children who come to be taught, she said. No, which I'm not. He nodded slowly. He had, she thought, already known this. He had been asking for clarity. She had given it to him. She went home in the last gray light of the afternoon. The snow was packed and hard underfoot, and the air was the kind of cold that pressed against your face with intent. She walked quickly, and she was thinking hard, not afraid, but thinking, working through what she knew and what she didn't and what came next. She almost walked past him. He, TBH, was at the edge of the path that led from the Phelps house to the back of the settlement, standing still enough that she nearly missed him in the low light. Look, Red Horse. He was on, I guess, foot, which was unusual. His presence here, this close to the settlement buildings, was a statement of some kind. She understood that, the same way she understood his words of the trading post, deliberately, with full awareness of how they'd read. She stopped. You heard, she said. Plus, I heard. He looked at her. The soldier spoke to you. Yes. You didn't move the children. No. He was quiet for a moment. The actually cold was very present between them, their breath visible, the settlement lights beginning to show in the windows around them. He said, Chayton told me what you did when the storm last month made the roof leak. That you, I guess, moved his chair yourself before the water reached it. She hadn't known the boy had told him that. It had been a very small thing, a drip, a child's work getting wet, a minute's worth of action. It wasn't thing, she said. He doesn't think it wasn't thing. She didn't know what to say to that. She looked at him in the failing light and thought about how strange it was that two people could come from entirely different worlds and still recognize something in each other. The same quality of stubbornness, maybe, or the same refusal to pretend that convenience and truth were the same thing. The soldier will come back, she said, with more pressure or more people. You know, honestly, that. Yes. What happens if he does? Red Horse looked at her. His eyes sort of were steady and direct. That depends on many things, he said. Plus, on who's careful and who's not. On whether the people in this settlement understand that there are ways of handling difficulty that do not require the army to handle it for them. Some of them understand that. Some, he agreed. Honestly, pause, and you aren't afraid of what the soldier thinks of you. I don't particularly care what he thinks of me. Why? Again, the same question. Not quite a question, and asking for honesty rather than an answer. She thought about it. Not performing the thinking, but actually doing it. Actually looking for the truest version of what she wanted to say. I spent a long time, she said, being very careful about what people thought of me. I was careful about it in a town where it didn't matter, and I'd very little to do. And being that careful didn't protect me from anything or help anyone. She paused. It just made me quieter. I'm not, interested in being quiet anymore. The silence between them was the comfortable kind. Not empty. Full. And he looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, My people have a word. Can't he waste? It means a good heart. A heart that gives without calculation. He said it with a care that made her understand he wasn't using it lightly. The children speak of you this way. She felt something move in her, deep, slow, not quite named. She held it carefully. I should get inside, she said. It's cold. Yes. To be fair, he didn't move. Then Mrs. and Whitmore. Something in the way he said her name, the name she had given him in the trading post, the name of the woman she had been before all of this started, made her look at him directly. I am glad, he said, that you aren't quiet. She walked home. She didn't run, and she walked with her back straight, and her breath clouding in the cold air, and she didn't turn around, and she felt the warmth of what he'd said moving through her in the cold like something lit from inside. In her room, she sat by the window and took out her notebook and wrote the word he'd taught her. Can't he waste? She wrote it slowly, getting the marks right. She looked at it. To be fair, a good heart. A heart that gives without calculation. Plus, sort of, she had not known, until he gave her the words for it, that this was what she had been trying to do. Not in my opinion, since the wagon train. Not since the boy by the trail. Maybe since before all of that. Maybe always underneath the careful quietness and the sensible decisions and the long, gray winter of being invisible. She closed the notebook, and outside the settlement was quiet and dark and cold, and the snow on the hills to the north reflected the quarter moon in a pale, diffuse light that made the whole landscape look like something painted from memory. She thought about Red Horse. She, in my opinion, thought about Chayton and Winona. She thought kind of about the soldier coming back and the pressure Phelps had warned her about. The choice she had already made, the one she'd made without quite knowing it, standing in the schoolhouse doorway with the cold coming in. She wasn't afraid. She thought, at the beginning of something. She didn't know what it was or where it was going. She had stopped believing that not knowing was the same as danger. The best things in her life, the things that had actually changed her, remade her into something more than the careful, invisible widow. In the upstairs room, had all arrived without announcement, without her permission, in the open air of a country too large to be managed. She would manage nothing. She would simply stay present and honest and capable, and she would teach the children who came to be taught, and she would speak the truth when the truth was called for, and she would trust that the rest would find its shape. She put out the lamp, which she slept, for the first time in months, without waking.